So let's look at the results of this Rational Speech Act modeling for explaining children's behavior in endorsing or not these kinds of ambiguous utterances. So every kitty didn't jump on the bed when you have two kitties on the bed and one kitty who didn't, right? And so the first thing they did is, what if you fiddle with the expectations about the world of the experiment, but keep everything else the same, right? Okay, so it's a pragmatic factor. So we could have no particular expectation about how good at jumping kitties are. Maybe 0 or 1 or 2 or all 3 will be successful, right? Or maybe we have strong beliefs about how good at jumping kitties are, which leads us to believe a certain number of them will make it over even before we see what happens. So what happens? Well, that turns out to matter. Our prior expectations about the world of kitties make a really big difference in our endorsement rate. So this is a pragmatic effect. If we have no particular expectation, we'll endorse this utterance about a little less than half the time. But if we think 0 kitties are likely to make it on the bed, we don't like to endorse this utterance at all, right? Why? Finding out not all of them made it isn't really that informative. We didn't think they were going to make it in the first place, so this is not a great utterance for this context, right? Versus if we think all 3 kitties are likely to jump on the bed, we're very likely to endorse this utterance. It's much higher. Why? Because finding out not all of them made it is very informative. We thought all of them were going to make it. So it's like, oh, okay, not all of them made it. That's informative, right? Now, what if we fiddle with the other pragmatic factor, which is expectations about the question under discussion, the QUD, but again, we keep everything else the same. All right, so we can have no particular expectation about the implicit question under discussion. Maybe we're interested in how many kitties made it, or if they all made it, or if none of them made it, whatever. We're not really interested. But maybe we have strong beliefs about what the conversation is actually about, right? And maybe we think one of these questions under discussion is privileged, right? So here's what happens. Our prior expectations about this implicit topic of conversation, the QUD, do make a reasonable difference in our endorsement rate, right? So once again, if we have no particular expectation, we'll endorse this utterance a little less than half the time. But if we think the QUD is about whether none succeeded, did no kitties succeed, we don't like this utterance at all, right? Why? Because finding out, again, that not all of them made it isn't very informative. We wanted to know if none of them made it. Saying not all of them doesn't tell us that. It's still uncertain whether none of them made it or not. Versus if we think that question under discussion is about whether all kitties succeeded, well, now we're likely to endorse the utterance. Why? Because finding out not all of them made it is very informative. We want to know whether all of them made it or not. And now not all of them made it is a great and informative answer, right? Great interpretation. How about the grammatical factor? All right, so what if we fiddle with expectations of how easy it is to access that inverse scope, that not all interpretation, right? So we might have no bias to favor the inverse scope over the surface scope. There's like a 50-50 shot of accessing it. It's not that hard, right? Either of them is sort of equally difficult. Or we could, skew it. Maybe it's easier to access the inverse scope, or it's harder to access the inverse scope, right? Okay. What happens? And the answer is not a whole lot. So we have no particular bias. Again, we'll endorse it a little less than half the time. But it doesn't seem to matter so much whether we favor the inverse scope or disfavor it. The endorsement rate doesn't change that much. It doesn't really go below 40% or above 60%. So the grammatical factor doesn't matter as much. Being able to access that scope doesn't seem to have the impact on children's endorsement rate. It's less likely to be responsible for children's shift in utterance endorsement behavior. So if this is true, then we would predict that pragmatic factors should be able to really just overwhelm this grammatical factor, because the grammatical factor of scope access really isn't doing that much to begin with, right? Is that true? It sure is, right? When your prior expectations are that kitties are really good at jumping and the QUD is about whether all of them succeeded, it really doesn't matter how easy or hard it is to access that scope. You still love to endorse this thing, right? So takeaway, the two pragmatic factors make the inverse scope interpretation very informative, and that really seems to drive the endorsement behavior that we're seeing.